Shafi here, and welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into today's story, I want to say thank you to all of you who have been sharing your own experiences in the comments. Your stories matter, and they remind us that we're not alone in facing betrayal and hardship. Today I'm going to share a story that one of our followers sent to me. They've asked to remain anonymous, and I've changed all the names and some details to protect their privacy. But the core of what happened? That's real. That's raw. And it's one of the most chilling tales of family betrayal I've ever come across. Imagine this. You're turning 70 years old. It's your birthday. You wake up in an empty house because your wife passed away 5 years ago, and your only son hasn't called you in months. You're hoping for something, anything, just a text message to remind you that you still matter. And then a package arrives. It's heavy. Expensive wrapping paper, a crystal decanter inside, a bottle of whiskey worth $2,000. The kind of gift that screams, "I love you, Dad." But here's the problem. Your son knows you can't drink alcohol. He knows that with your heart condition and the medications you take every single day, one glass of that whiskey could stop your heart cold. He was there in the hospital room 10 years ago when the doctor looked you in the eye and said, "If you drink again, you won't wake up." So why would he send you that bottle? That's the question our hero, Robert Mitchell, asked himself. And when he gave that bottle to someone else as a gift, when he told his son the next morning what he'd done, the sound that came out of his son's mouth wasn't confusion. It wasn't concern. It was pure, raw terror. Because that bottle wasn't a gift, it was a loaded weapon, and Robert had just handed it to the wrong man. Robert Mitchell was born in 1954 in Manchester, England. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood where his father worked double shifts at the textile mill and his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. Money was tight, but love wasn't. Robert learned early that hard work was the only ladder out of poverty. At 16, he left school and took a job in construction. He carried bricks in the summer heat. He lifted steel beams in the winter cold, the kind of cold that made your fingers stick to the metal. He saved every penny he earned. By the time he was 22, he had enough money to marry his sweetheart, Sarah, in a small church ceremony. They rented a tiny flat at first, but Robert had a dream. He wanted to own a home, not just any home, a Victorian house, the kind with character, with history, with bones that could last 100 years. In the 1980s, when the housing market crashed and everyone was fleeing the old neighborhoods, Robert saw an opportunity. He bought a crumbling Victorian mansion for almost nothing. It had broken windows, rotting floorboards, and walls that were more mold than plaster. But Robert saw potential. He spent the next 10 years restoring that house with his own 2 hands. He stripped the woodwork layer by layer until the original oak grain shone through. He relaid every floor plank. He replastered every wall. He carved the banister himself, sitting in the garage late at night with sandpaper and varnish, making something beautiful out of something broken. That house became his sanctuary. By the time he was done, it was worth over £3 million. But to Robert, it wasn't about the money. It was about what he had built. It was about legacy. Robert and Sarah had one son, Daniel, born in 1985. Robert was there for every moment. First steps in the living room, first words at the kitchen table, first day of school with a backpack. Robert bought using overtime pay. He taught Daniel how to ride a bike in the driveway, how to change a tire, how to look a man in the eye and tell the truth. Robert was proud of his boy. Daniel was smart, charming, always smiling. But somewhere along the way, the boy Robert raised disappeared. Daniel went to university. He studied law. He married a woman named Jessica, a sharp-tongued beauty from a wealthy family who looked down on Robert's working-class roots. They had 2 children, Robert's grandchildren, but visits became rare. Phone calls became shorter. Holidays were spent with Jessica's family. Robert told himself it was normal. Kids grow up. They have their own lives. Parents become background noise. And then Sarah got sick. Cancer, fast and cruel. She was gone in 6 months. The funeral was packed with neighbors and old friends. But Daniel barely stayed an hour. He had to get back to the city, he said. Work was busy. That was 5 years ago. Since then, Robert had been alone in the big house, walking the halls, touching the banister he'd carved, remembering Sarah's laugh. The silence had gotten louder. On his 70th birthday, a Tuesday in late November, Robert woke up to that silence. The house was cold. The sky outside was gray, threatening rain. He made himself a cup of tea and sat in his armchair by the window, waiting. The phone didn't ring. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he had given up hope. Daniel wasn't going to call. Jessica certainly wasn't going to call. He was just an old man in a big house waiting for the day to end. And then the doorbell rang. Robert shuffled to the door and opened it. A young man in a courier uniform stood there, holding a large box. "Delivery for Mr. Robert Mitchell?" the courier asked. "That's me," Robert said, his heart lifting just a little. Maybe they hadn't forgotten after all. He signed for the package and carried it inside. It was heavy. The wrapping paper was expensive, black with a satin finish, tied with a gold ribbon. Robert sat down at the kitchen table and carefully cut the tape with his pocket knife, the one he'd carried since 1975. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a crystal decanter. The label read, "Macallan 25-year-old Sherry Oak Cask." Robert knew that bottle. He used to drink Macallan back in the day before the heart attack that nearly killed him. It was a king's drink, a $2,000 bottle of liquid gold. He pulled it out slowly, feeling the weight of it in his hands. There was a small card tucked underneath. He opened it. "Happy birthday, Dad. Have a drink on me. Celebrate the big 7-0. Love, Daniel." Robert stared at those words for a long time. Have a drink on me. His son knew. Daniel had been there in the hospital waiting room 10 years ago, when the cardiologist, Dr. Wallace, had sat Robert down and said, "Mr. Mitchell, your drinking days are over. With the beta blockers and blood thinners you're on now, if you mix alcohol into your system, your heart will stop. You won't wake up." Daniel had stood right there. He had nodded. He had driven Robert home from the hospital and personally emptied every bottle from the liquor cabinet. He had poured them down the sink one by one while Robert sat at the kitchen table and watched. So why send this? Robert looked at the amber liquid inside the decanter. It glowed in the afternoon light, warm and inviting. For just a second he was tempted. One glass. Just one glass to celebrate surviving 70 years in this hard world. What could it hurt? Within his inspector's instinct kicked in. Robert had spent 40 years as a building inspector for the city of Manchester. He had crawled through basements and climbed into attics, shining his flashlight in the dark corners, looking for the cracks that would bring a house down. He had learned to spot structural failure before it killed someone. And right now, every instinct in his body was screaming, "Danger! Something is wrong. Why now? Why this specific gift?" Daniel knew Robert was strict about his health. He walked 5 miles every morning. He ate clean. He wanted to live long enough to see his grandchildren grow up, if Jessica ever let him see them. Sending him a bottle of alcohol felt like a slap in the face. It felt careless. It felt like Daniel didn't care whether Robert lived or died, as long as he could say he'd sent an expensive gift. Robert felt anger rising in his chest, hot and bitter. He wanted to smash the bottle against the wall. He wanted to call Daniel and scream at him. But Robert wasn't a man who wasted things. 2,000 pounds was 2,000 pounds. He had grown up in a time when you didn't throw away food, let alone a fortune in liquor. And then he thought of Thomas. Thomas Evans. Jessica's father, Daniel's father-in-law. A retired accountant who lived alone in a luxury flat downtown, about 20 minutes away. Thomas was a good man, quiet, soft-spoken. He suffered under Jessica's thumb just as much as Robert did. Jessica ran that family like a dictator, and Thomas's only escape was his evening scotch. He loved fine whiskey. He could talk for hours about peat smoke and oak barrels. Robert smiled faintly. If he couldn't enjoy this bottle, Thomas certainly could. It would be a nice gesture, a way to turn Daniel's thoughtlessness into something good. Plus, it would save Robert the trouble of buying Thomas a Christmas gift next month. Two birds, 1 stone. Robert carefully placed the bottle back into the box. He smoothed out the black satin lining. He retaped the box so it looked untouched. Then he sat down and wrote a new note on a plain piece of cardstock. Thomas, Daniel sent this to me, but you know I can't touch the stuff. No sense in letting good whiskey gather dust. Enjoy it for both of us. Happy early Christmas. Robert. He taped a note to the outside of the box, right over the original wrapping. Then he picked up the phone and called the local courier service, the same one he used for his rental properties. I need a package delivered downtown to Marina Towers, Robert said. Today. We'll have someone there in 30 minutes, Mr. Mitchell, the dispatcher replied. Robert waited by the window. When the courier van pulled up, he handed over the box. Handle it with care, Robert said. It's worth more than my car. The young driver laughed. You got it, sir. Robert watched the van drive away down the tree-lined street. The sky was darkening. Rain was starting to fall, light and cold. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had done the right thing. He had taken something that could have hurt him and turned it into an act of kindness. He made himself a cup of Earl Grey tea, hot and strong, the way Sarah used to make it. He sat back in his armchair by the window and watched the rain fall. This was his celebration. Quiet, dignified, sober. He didn't know it then, watching the rain streak down the glass, but that courier van wasn't just carrying a bottle of whiskey. It was carrying a bomb, and Robert had just unknowingly set the timer. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Robert cooked himself a steak, medium rare the way he liked it. He watched an old Western on the television, John Wayne riding across the screen, hat low, justice in his eyes. He went to bed early, around 9 o'clock, and fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping against the window. He slept soundly. The sleep of a man with a clear conscience. The next morning, Wednesday, Robert woke at 6:30. He made his tea, took his pills beta blockers, blood thinners, a statin for cholesterol, and sat down at the kitchen table with the newspaper. At 9 o'clock sharp, his phone rang. Robert looked at the caller ID. It was Daniel. He let it ring twice before answering. He didn't want Daniel to think he was sitting by the phone, waiting. "Hello, son," Robert said, keeping his voice even. "Hey, Dad." Daniel's voice sounded tight, strained. "Happy birthday for yesterday." "Thank you, Daniel." There was a pause. Robert could hear Daniel breathing on the other end of the line. It sounded fast, shallow, like a man who had just run up a flight of stairs. "Did you get the package?" Daniel asked. "I did," Robert said. "It arrived yesterday afternoon." "And did you open it?" "I did. Macallan 25. "That's a serious bottle of whiskey, Daniel." "Yeah. Well, you deserve the best, Dad. I wanted to get you something special." Robert frowned. Daniel's voice didn't sound right. It sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. "So," Daniel continued, his voice dropping slightly, "how was it?" "How was what?" Robert asked. "The whiskey. Did you try it? Did you have a glass last night?" Robert felt a chill go down his spine. He set his teacup down carefully on the saucer. Daniel never cared about whiskey. He drank cheap beer and vodka mixers. He couldn't tell the difference between a single malt and a blended scotch. So why was he suddenly so interested in the taste notes of a 25-year-old Macallan? "It was smooth," Robert said slowly, testing him. "Very smooth." "Good," Daniel said quickly. "That's good. Did you drink a lot? You know, to celebrate?" The chill turned into ice. Daniel wasn't asking if Robert had enjoyed the whiskey. He wasn't asking about the flavor, the finish, the complexity. He was asking about the dosage. He wanted to know how much of the liquid was currently inside his father's body. Robert felt his heart start to beat faster. Not from fear. Not yet. But from realization. "Actually, Daniel," Robert said, leaning back in his kitchen chair, "I didn't drink any of it." The silence on the line was instant. Heavy. Terrified. You didn't?" Daniel's voice cracked. "No. You know I can't drink, son. My heart medication. Dr. Wallace would have my head. And frankly, I quite like being alive." Robert heard Daniel exhale. It sounded like frustration, or panic, or something worse. Oh, right. Yeah, of course. Daniel's words were tumbling out now too fast. So, what did you do with it? Is it still there? No, Robert said casually. I didn't want it sitting in the house tempting me. You know how it is. An old man and his vices. So I re-gifted it. You what? Daniel's voice shot up an octave. It cracked like a teenager's. I gave it away, Daniel. I sent it over to Thomas. Thomas? Which Thomas? Your father-in-law, Thomas. Jessica's dad. I know he loves a good scotch. I had it couriered over yesterday afternoon. He probably opened it last night while watching the football match. The sound that came out of Daniel's mouth next was something Robert would never forget. It wasn't a word, it wasn't a sentence. It was a strangled noise, like an animal caught in a steel trap. A sound of pure, unadulterated horror. You gave it to Thomas! Daniel screamed. Yes, Robert said calmly. Why are you shouting? It's a nice gift. He'll appreciate it more than I would. Dad, you have to call him! Daniel was shouting now, his voice ragged. Call him right now! Tell him not to drink it. Why? Robert asked, his own voice dropping low and dangerous. It's just whiskey, Daniel. What is wrong with you? Just call him. No, wait, I'll call him. You didn't open the seal, did you? You didn't touch it? I told you I sent it right over. Daniel, what is going on? The line went dead. Robert sat there, holding the receiver, staring at the wall. His heart was beating faster now. Not because of the medication, because he knew. He had been a building inspector for 40 years. He knew when a structure was about to collapse. He knew the sound of a load-bearing wall giving way. He knew when the foundation was compromised. And that panic in his son's voice? That was the sound of a roof caving in. Why would Daniel be terrified of Thomas drinking a bottle of expensive scotch? Unless there was something wrong with the scotch. Unless the scotch wasn't meant to be drunk. Or rather, it was meant to be drunk. But only by one specific person. Robert stood up. His hands were shaking slightly. He grabbed his keys and his coat from the hook by the door. He didn't call Thomas. A phone call wasn't enough. If Daniel was reacting like that, something was very, very wrong. Robert needed to see this for himself. He walked out to his car, a vintage Jaguar he had restored himself years ago. He started the engine, the familiar rumble comforting. He pulled out of the driveway and headed toward downtown Manchester, toward Marina Towers, where Thomas lived. It was a 15-minute drive on a good day. Robert made it in 10. His mind was racing. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe Daniel had bought stolen whiskey. Maybe it was counterfeit, and he was afraid Thomas would notice and realize Daniel had been scammed. Maybe he was just embarrassed that Robert had given away his expensive gift. But the fear in Daniel's voice that wasn't embarrassment, that was mortal terror. As Robert turned onto the main avenue leading to Marina Towers, he heard them. Sirens, not one, but two, screaming down the street, weaving through the morning traffic, an ambulance and a police car. Their blue lights bounced off the glass windows of the high-rise buildings. Robert's stomach dropped. He felt like he had swallowed a stone. He pressed the accelerator. He followed the lights. He watched, his chest tightening, as both vehicles turned sharply into the entrance of Marina Towers. Thomas's building. No, Robert whispered. Please, God, no. He pulled up to the curb, ignoring the doorman, waving him away. He jumped out of the car, leaving the door open, and ran. He was 70 years old, and his knees weren't what they used to be, but he moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline and dread. He burst through the glass doors of the lobby, just as the lift doors opened. Paramedics were wheeling a stretcher out. There was a man strapped down. An oxygen mask clamped over his face. His body was jerking, convulsing in violent, unnatural spasms. His hands were clawing at the restraints. His eyes were rolled back in his head, showing only the whites. White foam was gathering at the corners of his mouth, bubbling up like a rabid animal. It was Thomas Evans, Robert's friend, his contemporary, the only other person in this twisted family who understood what it was like to be used by their children. "Thomas!" Robert shouted, his voice cracking. A paramedic pushed him back, his hand firm on Robert's chest. "Sir, stay back! Give us room!" "What happened?" Robert grabbed the man's sleeve. "I'm family. That's my son's father-in-law. What happened to him? Possible overdose or poisoning," the paramedic shouted over his shoulder as they rushed toward the waiting ambulance. "He was found unconscious on the floor. Seizing! We need to move now. Poisoning." The word hung in the cold morning air like toxic smoke. Robert stood there on the pavement, frozen, as the ambulance doors slammed shut. He watched it speed away, lights flashing red and blue against the gray Manchester sky. And then he saw it. A black Mercedes, screeching into the circular driveway of the building. Daniel's car. Daniel jumped out, wild-eyed, his hair disheveled, his shirt untucked. Jessica was with him, but she didn't look worried. She looked angry. She was typing furiously on her phone, her fingers moving like claws. They didn't see Robert. He was standing by a stone pillar, half hidden in the shadows. They ran toward the doorman. "My father," Jessica shouted, her voice high and sharp. "Is he okay? Did he drink it?" Robert stepped out from behind the pillar. "He's on his way to the ICU," Robert said quietly. They both spun around. Daniel's face went white, not pale. White. The color of old ash. He looked like a ghost. He looked like a man who had just seen his own grave. But Jessica? Jessica looked at Robert with cold, hard calculation. "You," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "This is your fault." "My fault?" Robert repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Jessica took a step closer. Her eyes were like chips of ice. And then she said it. She whispered it. Almost too low to hear, but Robert heard every syllable. "You were supposed to drink it." The world stopped. Everything. The sounds of the traffic, the rain starting to fall, the distant wail of the ambulance siren, all of it, faded into a dull roar. Robert looked at his son. Daniel couldn't meet his eyes. He was shaking. His hands were trembling. He looked like he was about to collapse. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The bottle wasn't a gift. It was a weapon. Daniel hadn't sent it out of love. He had sent it out of greed. He had tried to kill his own father. And Robert, in his kindness, had passed that death sentence onto an innocent man. Robert didn't say another word. He turned around, walked back to his car, got in, and sat there for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. And then, for the first time in 5 years since Sarah's funeral, Robert Mitchell began to cry. Not out of sadness, out of pure, ice-cold rage. Robert sat in his car outside Marina Towers for 20 minutes, watching the rain streak down the windshield. He wasn't crying anymore. The tears had dried. What was left behind was something colder, harder, clarity. He had spent 40 years as a building inspector. He knew how to assess damage. He knew how to look at a crumbling wall and trace the cracks back to the source. And right now, the source of this disaster was sitting in a black Mercedes 2 floors above him. Probably making phone calls, probably trying to cover their tracks. Robert wiped his face with the back of his hand. He started the engine. He didn't go home. He drove to the hospital. Chicago Mercy Hospital smelled like antiseptic and desperation. Robert walked through the automatic doors into the emergency waiting room. It was Pat mothers holding crying children, an old man clutching his chest, a young woman with a bandage wrapped around her hand. Robert walked up to the reception desk. "I'm here about Thomas Evans," he said. "He was just brought in by ambulance. Possible poisoning." The nurse, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, typed into her computer. "Are you family?" she asked without looking up. "I'm his son-in-law's father," Robert said. "We're close." She looked at him over her glasses, sizing him up. Then she sighed. "He's in the ICU. 4th floor, but you won't be able to see him. He's in critical condition. Immediate family only." "Thank you," Robert said. He took the lift to the 4th floor. The ICU was a maze of white hallways and beeping machines. Robert found a chair in the waiting area and sat down. 5 minutes later, Daniel and Jessica arrived. They didn't see Robert. He was sitting in a corner, half hidden behind a potted plant, watching them. Daniel looked like he was going to be sick. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He kept running his fingers to his hair, a nervous tic. Robert recognized from when Daniel was a child and had done something wrong. Jessica, on the other hand, looked composed, cold. She was on her phone, typing furiously, her jaw set. A doctor in blue scrubs came through the double doors. "Family of Thomas Evans," the doctor called out. Jessica rushed over, grabbing the doctor's arm with both hands. "Doctor, how is he? Is he alive? Please tell me he's alive." The doctor gently removed her hands. "Mrs. Evans, your father is stable for now, but he's in critical condition. He's on a ventilator. He suffered a massive seizure that led to cardiac arrest. We managed to get his heart rhythm back, but his brain activity is concerning." "What caused it?" Robert asked, standing up and stepping forward. The doctor looked at him. "And you are?" "A friend of the family," Robert said evenly. The doctor sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's hard to say definitively without the toxicology report, but given his age and medical history, it looks like either a severe stroke or possibly an adverse reaction to a medication or substance he ingested." "Did he eat anything unusual today?" the doctor asked, turning back to Jessica. "Take anything new?" Jessica shook her head vigorously. "No, nothing. He eats the same thing every day. Oatmeal and toast. He's healthy as a horse." Robert felt a surge of fury. She was lying. She knew about the bottle, but she wasn't going to mention it. Whatever had happened, whatever was in that whiskey, Jessica was already trying to bury it. "Whatever it was," the doctor continued, "it hit him hard and fast. We're treating it as a cerebrovascular event for now. We'll know more in 24 hours. You should go home, get some rest. There's nothing you can do here tonight." Jessica slumped against Daniel, burying her face in his shoulder. "Oh, thank God it wasn't, you know, something else," she said, her voice muffled. Robert narrowed his eyes. "Something else? Like what, Jessica? Like poison?" He didn't say anything. He just watched them. Daniel looked up and saw Robert standing there. Their eyes met. For just a second, Robert saw the little boy who used to wait for him on the front porch after work, holding a drawing he'd made in school, excited to show his dad. But that boy was gone. The man standing in front of him now was a stranger. Daniel looked away first. "I need some air," Daniel muttered, pushing Jessica away gently. "I'll be outside." He turned and walked toward the exit, his shoulders hunched. Robert followed. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet, reflecting the neon glow of the hospital sign. Daniel stood by the edge of the car park, his hands in his pockets, staring at nothing. Robert walked up beside him. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the city lights. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I didn't think he'd actually drink it." Robert's blood turned to ice. "What did you just say?" Robert asked quietly. Daniel turned to look at him. His eyes were red, but not from crying, from exhaustion, from fear. "Thomas, I didn't think he'd drink it. I thought you would." Robert felt the world tilt sideways. "You tried to kill me," Robert said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Daniel didn't deny it. He just looked down at his shoes and nodded. "Why?" Robert asked. His voice was steady, but inside, his heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. "Debt," Daniel whispered. "I'm drowning, Dad. I lost £500,000 in cryptocurrency. I borrowed money from people you don't borrow money from. Russian loan sharks. They're going to kill me. They're going to kill Jessica. They're going to take our house, our kids, everything." "So you decided to kill me?" Robert's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "I'm your father, Daniel. I didn't have a choice," Daniel shouted back, his voice cracking. The payment is due next week. £200,000 or they break my legs, or worse. And your estate, your buildings, your land, the savings, it's worth $4 million. If you died, I'd inherit it all immediately. I could pay them off. I could save my family. Robert stared at his son. I am your family, Robert said quietly. Daniel shook his head. You don't understand. You've never understood. You sit in that big house alone with all that money, and you don't do anything with it. You don't help me. You just judge me. Because you never asked for help. Robert roared. You never came to me and said, Dad, I'm in trouble. You just smiled and lied and pretended everything was fine. And when you finally did reach out, it wasn't with words, it was with poison. Daniel flinched. It wasn't supposed to hurt, he said weakly. The doctor said it would just look like a heart attack. You wouldn't feel anything. You'd just go to sleep. Robert felt bile rise in his throat. What doctor? He asked. Daniel didn't answer. What doctor, Daniel? Dr. Thorne, Daniel whispered. Jessica found him. He's a private consultant. He helped us figure out the dosage. Digoxin. Your own heart medication, mixed with antifreeze to mask the taste. It would stop your heart in 20 minutes. No pain, no autopsy, just an old man with a bad heart finally giving out. Robert took a step back. His son had planned this, down to the chemical composition, down to the timeline. And Thomas? Robert asked, his voice hollow. What about Thomas? He's lying in there with foam coming out of his mouth because of you. That was an accident, Daniel said desperately. You weren't supposed to give it away. You were supposed to drink it. And now Thomas is. He stopped, his face crumpling. God, what have I done? Robert looked at his son for a long moment, and then he turned and walked away. Dad! Daniel called after him. Dad, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Robert didn't look back. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove. He drove for an hour, aimlessly, through the rain-slicked streets of Manchester. He drove past the park, where he used to push Daniel on the swings, past the school where he watched Daniel graduate, past the church where Sarah was buried. He was looking for the boy he had raised, but that boy was gone. Finally, at midnight, Robert pulled into an empty car park and sat there in the darkness. He pulled out his phone. He made 2 calls. The first was to Ray Vance, a private investigator and ex-police officer who owed Robert a favor. Ray, Robert said when the line picked up, I need a full financial background check on my son and his wife. Everything. Bank accounts, debts, credit cards, investments. I want to know how deep the hole is. When do you need it? Ray asked. By sunrise. The second call was to a man named Silas, the head of maintenance at Manchester General Hospital. Silas, it's Robert Mitchell. I need a favor, a big one. Name it, Mr. Mitchell. You saved my arse on that basement renovation. I need a camera installed in the ICU, room 402, inside the smoke detector, pinhole lens, live feed to my laptop. There was a pause. That's highly illegal, Robert. I know, but a man's life is on the line, and I need to know the truth. Silas sighed. I'll have it done by morning. Robert hung up. He sat there in the car, staring at the rain running down the windshield. His son had tried to kill him. His son had poisoned an innocent man, and now Robert was going to do what he had done for 40 years. He was going to inspect the structure. He was going to find every crack, every flaw, every weak point. And then he was going to bring the whole house down. Robert wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a hunter. And the prey had no idea the trap was already being set. By 6 o'clock the next morning, Robert's phone buzzed with an incoming email. The subject line read, The Bleeding Financial Report on Daniel Mitchell and Jessica Evans. Robert opened it. What he saw made his stomach turn. Daniel wasn't just in debt, he was drowning. The report detailed everything. Cryptocurrency losses, £523,000 lost in a speculative altcoin that crashed 3 months ago. Loan shark debt, £200,000 owed to a private lending firm with ties to organized crime in London. Payment due in 6 days. Mortgage. Second mortgage taken out on the house without Jessica's knowledge, or so the paperwork claimed, £180,000 outstanding. Credit cards. 4 cards maxed out. Total debt, £65,000. And then there was Jessica's spending. Designer handbags, £22,000 in the last year alone. Spa treatments and luxury holidays, £38,000. Private school fees for the kids, £25,000 per year. They were living a lie. A glossy Instagram perfect lie built on a foundation of sand. And the only way out was Robert's estate. Robert's assets were worth approximately £4.2 million. 3 apartment buildings in South Manchester, fully occupied, generating rental income. A commercial plot of land recently rezoned for development, worth £2 million alone. Savings and investments, £1 million. The Victorian mansion, £1.2 million. If Robert died, Daniel would inherit it all immediately. He could pay off the Russians, clear the mortgage, wipe Jessica's debts, and still have enough left over to live like a king. Robert closed the laptop. He sat back in his chair, his hands shaking. His son hadn't just betrayed him. His son had commodified him, turned him into a number on a balance sheet. Robert stood up and walked to the window. The sun was rising over Manchester, painting the sky pink and gold. It was a beautiful morning. But Robert felt nothing. Camera installed. Feed is live. Login details attached. Robert opened his laptop and logged into the secure server Silas had set up. The screen flickered to life. Black and white, grainy, but clear enough. It was a view from above, looking down into ICU room 402. Thomas was lying in the bed, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with the help of the ventilator. Monitors beeped steadily. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting IV drips. Robert watched for 2 hours, and then, at 10:15 a.m., the door opened. Jessica walked in. She was alone. She was dressed in a sleek black dress, her hair pulled back, her makeup perfect. She looked like she was going to a business meeting, not visiting her dying father. She didn't rush to the bedside. She walked slowly, deliberately, looking around the room. She glanced up at the security camera in the corner the official won and positioned herself so her back was to it. Smart, but she didn't know about the smoke detector. Robert's hidden camera caught her face perfectly. There were no tears, no grief, just cold, hard calculation. Jessica walked to the side of the bed and looked down at her father. Thomas's eyes fluttered open. He looked up at her, confused, weak. Jessica leaned down and brushed a strand of gray hair off his forehead. It looked, from a distance, like a tender gesture. And then she spoke. Robert had the volume turned all the way up. The microphone in the smoke detector was sensitive. It picked up every word. "Hi, Daddy," Jessica whispered. Thomas tried to speak. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The stroke had paralyzed his vocal cords. "Shh," Jessica said, putting a manicured finger to his lips. "Don't try to talk. The doctor says you can't speak yet." She paused, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "That's actually a good thing, isn't it? Because if you could talk, you might say something stupid." Thomas's eyes widened. He didn't understand. "You remember the whiskey, don't you, Daddy?" Jessica asked softly. "The Macallan? The one Robert sent you?" Thomas blinked. A single tear leaked from the corner of his eye. He remembered. "I know you figured it out," Jessica continued, leaning closer so her mouth was inches from his ear. "You're smart. You always were. You realized it tasted wrong. Maybe you even realized it was poison." Thomas's good hand clenched the bedsheet. He started to shake. The heart monitor began to beep faster. Beep, 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 beep. "Calm down," Jessica hissed. "If the nurses come in, I'll leave. And you don't want to be alone, do you?" She waited until he stopped struggling, until she had total control. "Listen to me very carefully, Daddy," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. That bottle wasn't meant for you. It was a mistake, a stupid clerical error. It was meant for Robert. Robert, watching the screen, felt his hands curl into fists. Thomas's face contorted in horror. He was hearing his daughter confess to attempted murder. But you drank it, Jessica sighed, as if he had inconvenienced her. And now we're in a mess, a big mess. She grabbed his good hand. She squeezed it, not with love, with force. Robert could see her knuckles turning white. If you tell anyone, Jessica said slowly, deliberately, if you manage to scribble a note, or blink a code, or find any way to tell the police about that bottle, do you know what will happen? She paused. I'll go to prison, Daddy. Your little girl. Your Jessie. I'll go to a federal prison for the rest of my life. Is that what you want? Do you want to see me in a cage? Do you want to destroy my life because of a mistake? Thomas stared at her, tears streaming down his face. The betrayal in his eyes was so raw it hurt to watch. And it's not just me, Jessica added, playing her ace card. It's Daniel, too. And your grandchildren. If I go away, everything falls apart. The house, the family, the legacy. You'll be all alone in a state facility with no one to pay your bills. She stroked his cheek. The touch made Thomas flinch. So here's the deal, Jessica said, her voice like ice. You're going to be quiet. You're going to focus on getting better. And when the police ask you what happened, you're going to shake your head. You don't remember. It was just a stroke, just bad luck. She leaned in even closer, her lips almost touching his ear. Because if you don't, she hissed, if you decide to be a hero, I will tell them you were depressed. I will tell them you bought the poison yourself. I will tell them you tried to kill yourself because you were lonely. And I will make sure everyone believes it. I will ruin your reputation before I let you ruin my life. Thomas closed his eyes. Fresh tears soaked the pillow. He was broken, not by the poison, by the words. Good, Jessica said, straightening up and smoothing her dress. I knew you'd understand. You've always been a good father, always sacrificing for me. She looked at her watch. I have to go now. Daniel's waiting in the car. He's too weak to come up here. He's crying. He loves you so much, Daddy. We both do. She bent down and kissed his forehead. A Judas kiss. Sleep now, she whispered. And remember, silence is golden. She turned and walked out of the room. As she opened the door, her face transformed instantly. The coldness vanished, replaced by a mask of tragic grief for the benefit of the nurses in the hallway. Robert sat in his study, staring at the screen. The feed showed Thomas, weeping silently in his hospital bed. Robert reached out and stopped the recording. He saved the file. He named it Confession. This video was the nail in her coffin. It proved motive. It proved intent. It proved she was the mastermind. Daniel might be the weak executioner, but Jessica was the judge and jury. Robert stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. Hold on, old friend, he whispered. You don't have to speak. You don't have to say a word. I heard everything. Robert wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. He was building a case that would stand up in court, a case that would stand up in court, a case that would send his own son and daughter-in-law to prison, and he was just getting started. Robert spent the next 24 hours setting the trap. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just worked. First, he called his lawyer, a man named Denzel Washington, no relation to the actor, but just as intimidating. Denzel was 6'4", a former rugby player who had put himself through law school by working construction. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a bodyguard. But he was the best. Denzel, Robert said when the line picked up, I need you to draft a document. What kind of document? Denzel asked. A power of attorney. But I want you to bury a clause in there. A clause that triggers only if I'm declared mentally incompetent. There was a pause. Okay, Denzel said slowly. And who are we giving this power to? To Daniel, Robert said. Silence. Robert, Denzel said carefully, are you out of your bloody mind? Exactly the opposite, Robert said. I'm going to dangle the one thing he wants more than anything in the world. Control. I'm going to let him think he's won, and then I'm going to lock the gates and burn the castle down with him inside. Denzel chuckled darkly. I'll have it ready by tomorrow. Next, Robert called Ray Vance again. Ray, I need surveillance equipment, hidden cameras, audio bugs, the works. For your own house? Ray asked. Yes. Robert, whatever you're planning, I'm planning to catch a wolf, Ray, and you catch a wolf with bait. That evening, Robert set the stage. He called Daniel. Son, Robert said, his voice weak and shaky. I need to talk to you. Dad! Daniel sounded surprised, wary. Are you okay? No, Robert said. I'm not. I've been thinking about what you said, about the debt, about the pressure you're under. Silence on the line. And? Daniel asked carefully. And I want to help, Robert said. But I'm not well, Daniel. I can feel it, the stress, the worry. My heart, it's getting worse. Dad, you need to see a doctor. I did. Robert lied. Dr. Wallace says I need to reduce stress. He says I need to simplify my affairs, make sure everything is in order. What do you mean? Daniel's voice was tight with anticipation. I want to sign a power of attorney, Robert said. Give you control, so if something happens to me, you can take care of things. The buildings, the land, the accounts. I don't want the state taking it. I don't want solicitors fighting over it. I want you to have it. Robert could hear Daniel breathing hard on the other end of the line. Dad, are you serious? I'm dying, son, Robert whispered, and I don't want to die knowing I left you with nothing. There was a long pause, and then Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion or greed. Robert couldn't tell anymore. Thank you, Dad. Thank you so much. Come by tomorrow, Robert said. Bring Jessica. We'll sign the papers. He hung up. And then Robert smiled. A cold, dangerous smile. Let's see how greedy you really are, he whispered to the empty room. The next morning, Daniel and Jessica arrived at Robert's house at 9 a.m. sharp. Robert answered the door in his dressing gown, looking frail and confused. Daniel? Robert said, blinking. What day is it? It's Wednesday, Dad, Daniel said gently. We're here to sign the papers, remember. Oh? Yes, the papers. Robert shuffled into the dining room, leaning heavily on the furniture. Jessica followed, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Sitting at the table were two men. The first was Arthur Gable, a sleazy solicitor Daniel and Jessica had hired. He was short, balding, with a suit that didn't fit and a nervous twitch in his left eye. The second was Denzel. Denzel didn't smile. He just nodded at Robert. Shall we begin? Gable said, rubbing his hands together. He pulled out a thick document and slid it across the table toward Robert. Mr. Mitchell, Gable said, his voice oily. This is a power of attorney document that gives your son, Daniel, full control over your estate in the event that you are declared mentally or physically incapable of managing your own affairs. Robert put on his reading glasses. His hands shook as he picked up the document. Read it to me, Robert said. My eyes, they're not good today. Gable began to read. It all sounded standard, benevolent even, until he got to Clause 4, Section B. However, Gable read, speeding up slightly. Until such time as the principal is declared incompetent, the appointed agent shall have discretionary power to manage, sell, or leverage assets as deemed necessary for the health and welfare of the principal. There it was, discretionary power. That meant Daniel could sell the apartment buildings tomorrow. He could drain the accounts. He could take everything and claim it was for Robert's health. It was a license to steal. Robert looked at Daniel. Daniel was staring at the table, refusing to meet his eyes. Is this what you want, Dad? Daniel asked quietly. Robert let a single tear roll down his cheek. For you, son? Yes. Then sign it, Jessica said, her voice too loud, too eager. Robert reached for the pen Gable was holding out. Wait, Denzel said. Everyone froze. I need to review the document, Denzel said calmly. As Mr. Mitchell's personal counsel, I cannot allow him to sign something I haven't vetted. Gable bristled. I sent you the draft this morning by courier, Mr. Washington. I received a draft, Denzel said, holding out his hand. I want to make sure this is the same document. Jessica looked like she was about to explode, but Daniel put a hand on her arm. It's standard procedure, Daniel said quickly. Let him read it. Gable handed the document to Denzel. Denzel took it. He didn't read it quickly. He took his time. He turned every page. He adjusted his glasses. He hummed and hawed. The silence in the room was suffocating. While Denzel was reading, Robert triggered the distraction. He started to cough. It started as a dry hack, then escalated into a full-blown choking fit. Robert grabbed his chest. He knocked his teacup off the table. Crash! Water! Robert gasped. Oh, God! Daniel jumped up and ran to the kitchen. Jessica stood up, looking panicked. Is he okay? Gable asked, half rising. And in that moment of chaos, Denzel moved. It was beautiful. While everyone was watching Robert, Denzel slid Gable's document into his own briefcase and slid a different document onto the table. It looked identical. Same blue cover, same thickness, same font, but the words inside were very, very different. By the time Daniel ran back in with a glass of water, the switch was done. Robert drank, spilling some down his chin. I'm okay, he wheezed. Let's finish this. Denzel handed the document back to Robert. He looked Robert right in the eye. It looks in order, Robert, Denzel said. It reflects your wishes perfectly. Robert knew what that meant. The real document, Denzel's version, left everything to a trust managed by a bank. Daniel and Jessica would have no access, no control, just a small monthly allowance for Robert's care. If Robert signed this, they would get nothing. Robert picked up the pen. Daniel and Jessica leaned in, holding their breath. Robert signed his name, Robert J. Mitchell. It's done, Robert whispered. Jessica snatched the document before the ink was even dry. We need to get this notarized and filed, she said to Gable. Right away, Gable said, standing up. They left. As soon as the door closed, Robert looked at Denzel. Did they take the bait? Robert asked. Denzel grinned. Hook, line, and sinker. Robert had just given his son exactly what he wanted. Or so Daniel thought. But what Daniel didn't know was that the document he was holding was worthless, and by the time he found out, it would be too late. That night, Robert sat in his study with all the lights off. The only glow came from his laptop screen, blue and cold, casting shadows across the walls. He had wired his entire house with hidden cameras and microphones, small lenses tucked into smoke detectors, audio devices hidden behind bookshelves, all feeding to a secure server in his basement. He had done it quietly, methodically, the way he used to inspect buildings before signing off on their safety. No one knew. Not Daniel, not Jessica, not even Denzel. This was between Robert and the truth. The clock on the wall showed 11:17 in the evening. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Thomas's face, foam at the corners of his mouth, eyes rolled back. He saw Daniel's face on the phone, the panic, the terror. He saw Jessica whispering threats over her father's hospital bed. He waited. At 2:32 in the morning, the motion sensor in the garage triggered. A soft chime on Robert's laptop. He leaned forward. The camera feed flickered to life, grainy black and white night vision, but clear enough. The side door to the garage opened slowly. Daniel stepped inside. He was wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, black gloves on his hands, a small torch in one fist, and a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters in the other. He looked around once, nervous, quick, then closed the door quietly behind him. Robert watched, his breath held, his heart pounding. Daniel moved to the workbench where Robert's tools were neatly organized. He set the torch down. The beam pointed at Robert's vintage Jaguar. The car sat there, cherry red paint gleaming faintly even in the darkness. Robert had restored that car himself, new engine, new suspension, every bolt tightened with his own hands. He had taught Daniel how to change the oil in that car when Daniel was 14 years old. They had laughed when oil splashed on Daniel's shirt. Robert had said, "Scars give character, son." And Daniel had grinned and replied, "Then I must be full of character, Dad." Now Daniel knelt beside the car. He shone the torch into the wheel well. He slid underneath the chassis on his back, his legs sticking out, his white trainers still clean despite the garage floor. Robert zoomed the camera in as far as it would go. He could see Daniel's chest rising and falling rapidly. He was breathing hard. He was scared. And then Robert heard it. Snip. The sound was small, metallic, sharp, but to Robert it was like thunder cracking inside his skull. The brake line, primary line. Fluid began to drip onto the concrete, dark and wet, pooling slowly. Snip. The backup line. More fluid. A puddle formed beneath the car. Daniel slid out from under the chassis. He stood up, wiping his gloved hands on his jeans, leaving dark streaks. He looked down at the puddle of brake fluid. He kicked some sawdust over it, just enough to hide the leak so Robert wouldn't notice during a casual walk around the car, but not enough to stop the catastrophic failure that would happen the moment Robert tried to brake going down a hill. Daniel looked around the garage one more time, and then, for just a second, he looked directly at the camera. He didn't know it was there. He was just glancing at the ceiling, at the old beams, maybe remembering the times he used to play in this garage as a boy. Tears were streaming down his face. He was crying while he sabotaged the car that would kill his father. Robert sat back in his chair, his own hands trembling. He didn't move for a long time. The screen stayed frozen on the image of the empty garage, the puddle of brake fluid glistening faintly in the moonlight coming through the small window. Robert felt nothing at first, and then the feeling came slow and heavy, like a foundation settling into mud. Not anger. Not yet. Grief. Pure, hollow, aching grief. The boy who used to run to him after school with a drawing clutched in his hand was gone. The man who had just crawled under that car to cut his father's brakes had taken his place. Robert closed the laptop. He stood up and walked to the window. Snow had started to fall again, soft white flakes drifting down through the darkness. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the promise he had made to her the night Daniel was born, holding that tiny baby in his arms. "I'll protect him, Sarah. I'll teach him right. I'll make sure he never has to struggle like we did." He had kept that promise. He had worked 2 jobs. He had saved every penny. He had built an empire from nothing. And Daniel had destroyed it. Robert went down to the basement. He checked the recording. It was saved, time-stamped, crystal clear. He made 3 copies, one on a USB drive, one uploaded to a secure cloud server, one emailed directly to Denzel with a single line in the subject, "Watch this. Call the police chief in the morning." Then he went back upstairs. He sat in his armchair in the dark and waited for dawn. The next morning, Robert called Denzel. "I have video," Robert said, his voice steady and cold. "Marcus cutting the brake lines on my car. Last night, 2:32 in the morning." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and then Denzel said quietly, "I'm coming over. Don't touch anything. Don't go near that car." Denzel arrived 30 minutes later. Robert played the footage without saying a word. When it ended, Denzel sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. "This is attempted murder," Denzel said. "Premeditated. We can charge him today." Robert shook his head. "Not yet. I want them to think they've gotten away with it. I want them to feel safe, and then I want to watch their faces when it all comes crashing down." Denzel looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. "What's the plan?" Robert explained everything. A controlled crash, a stunt driver, police on standby, a fake death in the hospital, a confession trap, and finally, a courtroom. Denzel listened without interrupting. When Robert finished, Denzel said, "If anything goes wrong, Robert, if this backfires, it won't," Robert said. "I've spent 40 years finding weak points in structures. I know exactly how to make them collapse." They shook hands. Robert called Police Chief Miller, an old friend from his days inspecting city buildings. Miller had always respected Robert, trusted his judgment. "Chief," Robert said, "I need your help. My son just tried to kill me. And I have it on video." Miller arrived within the hour. Robert showed him the footage. Miller watched it twice, his jaw tight. "This is enough to arrest him right now, Robert," Miller said. "But I understand if you want to do this your way. What do you need from me?" Robert laid out the plan. A professional stunt driver to take the car down the hill. Paramedics and police standing by. A staged crash that would look real enough to fool Daniel and Jessica. Miller nodded slowly. "We'll do it. But Robert, you're playing a dangerous game." "I've been playing it since the day I opened that bottle," Robert said. "This is just the final move." The next morning, Robert called Daniel. "Son," Robert said, his voice weak and shaky, "I'm not feeling well. I need to go to the clinic for a checkup. Just routine, but the doctor wants to see me. Do you want me to drive you?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. "No. No," Robert said. "I'll take the car. The fresh air will do me good." There was a pause on the line, and then Daniel said, "Okay, Dad, drive safe." Robert hung up. He looked at Chief Miller, who was standing in the hallway. "He took the bait," Robert said. "He thinks I'm going to die in that car today." Miller nodded grimly. "Let's make sure that doesn't happen." Robert walked out to the garage. The Jaguar was sitting there, the puddle of brake fluid now dried into a dark stain on the concrete. Robert ran his hand along the hood one last time. This car had been his pride and joy. He had spent hundreds of hours restoring it, every panel straightened, every piece of chrome polished, and now his own son had turned it into a death trap. Robert got into the driver's seat. He started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the garage. He backed out slowly, carefully, and drove 3 blocks to the rendezvous point. A police van was waiting in an alley. Chief Miller stepped out, along with a young man in protective gear. "This is Danny," Miller said. "He's one of the best stunt drivers in the country. He's going to tape the car from here." Danny shook Robert's hand. "We'll make it look real, Mr. Mitchell." "Don't worry," Robert nodded. He climbed out of the car and got into Miller's unmarked vehicle. They followed at a distance as Danny drove the Jaguar toward the hill on 47th Street. It was a steep, winding road that ended in a sharp curve with a line of massive oak trees guarding a ravine. Dangerous even with good brakes. Without them, it was a death sentence. Danny accelerated. 40 miles per hour. 50. The brake lights flared once, twice, the distress signal they had agreed on. And then the swerve. Danny yanked the wheel hard to the right at the last possible second, aiming for the narrow gap between the guardrail and the largest tree. He bailed out of the car, rolling onto the grass in a practiced maneuver, just 2 seconds before impact. The Jaguar didn't stop. For a brief, surreal moment, it was airborne, a ton of red steel against the gray winter sky. And then gravity took over. The car slammed into the trunk of the oak tree with a sickening crunch. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The hood crumpled like paper. Steam hissed from the radiator. The car spun once and slid halfway down the embankment, coming to rest against a boulder. Silence. And then, faintly, birds started singing again, oblivious to the violence. Robert sat in Miller's car, staring at the wreckage. His car, his memories. "Destroyed. That could have been you," Miller said quietly. Robert nodded. "I know." Miller picked up his radio. "Dispatch, this is Chief Miller. We have a confirmed 1050 at 47th and King. Vehicle totaled. Driver critical. Send EMS and fire immediately." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Chief. Units en route." Miller looked at Robert. Now we wait for their reaction. Back at Daniel's house, the notification came through on Jessica's phone. She had installed a tracking app on Robert's mobile months ago, telling him it was for safety in case you have a fall, Dad. The blue dot on the map stopped moving. The speed dropped from 50 miles per hour to 0 instantly. Jessica stared at the screen, and then she screamed. He crashed. Oh my God, he crashed. Daniel ran into the room. What? Who? Your father. Look. She shoved the phone in his face. Daniel's face went white. He grabbed his coat. We have to go. We have to go to the hospital. They jumped into their car and sped toward Manchester General Hospital. Meanwhile, Robert was being smuggled through the back entrance by Chief Miller. They took him up to a private room in the ICU, the same ICU where Thomas was still recovering. They hooked Robert up to monitors but didn't turn them on. They put a bandage around his head with fake blood. They tore his shirt strategically. They made him look like a man who had gone 10 rounds with a freight train. Robert lay in the hospital bed, perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing shallow. Ready? Miller asked. Robert nodded. Let them come. 10 minutes later, the door to the hospital room burst open. Jessica ran in first, her heels clicking loudly on the tile floor. Oh my God, she shrieked. It was a performance worthy of an award. She rushed to the bedside and threw herself across Robert's chest. Robert, please tell me he's alive. She grabbed his hand, her nails digging in, testing for a reaction. Robert stayed completely limp. He let his head loll to the side, mouth slightly open, a thin line of fake saliva pooling at the corner of his lips. Jessica lifted her head. She looked at the monitor. It was dark. Off. She looked at the doctor standing by the window, one of Miller's trusted colleagues. Is he dead? She asked, her voice trembling with fake grief. He's in a coma, the doctor said gravely. His injuries are severe. Internal bleeding, head trauma. We're doing everything we can, but it doesn't look good. You should prepare yourselves. Jessica buried her face in Robert's chest again. Robert could feel her shaking, but she wasn't crying. She was laughing. Silently, her shoulders heaving with suppressed joy. She thought she had won. Marcus stepped into the room slowly. He looked at Robert lying there, bruised and broken, and his face crumpled. I did this, Marcus whispered. What? Jessica snapped, lifting her head sharply. I should have checked the car, Marcus stammered, covering his mistake. The brakes felt soft last week. I should have taken it to the shop. It's not your fault, baby, Jessica said, standing up and pulling him into a hug. It was an accident, a terrible, tragic accident. But we're here now. We'll take care of everything. She looked over Marcus's shoulder at the doctor. If he passes, what's the procedure? We'll need to contact the coroner, the doctor said. And since it was a traffic accident, there will be an investigation. Investigation? Jessica's voice tightened. Standard procedure, the doctor said, to rule out mechanical failure or foul play. Robert felt Jessica stiffen against Marcus. Of course, she said carefully. But the car was old. It was probably just rust or worn parts. Probably, the doctor agreed. Robert lay there listening to them discuss his autopsy as if he were already dead. Marcus pulled away from Jessica. I need to sit down, he said. He walked to the chair in the corner and collapsed into it, putting his head between his knees. He was dry heaving, the guilt eating him alive. Jessica walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. Pull yourself together, she hissed under her breath. It's over. We won. We're free. Marcus looked up at her, his eyes hollow. Free? He whispered. I don't feel free, Tiff. I feel like I'm in hell. You'll feel better when the money clears, she said coldly. Now stand up. The police are coming to take a statement. You need to look sad, not guilty. 5 minutes later, Chief Miller walked into the room. He wasn't smiling. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Jessica. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell? He asked. Yes, Jessica said quickly, wiping a fake tear. We're his family. I'm Chief Miller. I'm sorry to disturb you at a time like this, but I need to ask you a few questions about the accident. Of course, Jessica said. We want to know what happened too. Miller pulled out a small notebook. We examined the scene. The vehicle struck the tree at approximately 50 miles per hour. There were no skid marks. No skid marks, Marcus whispered. That means he didn't break, Miller said. Or he couldn't break. He was old, Jessica said quickly. Maybe he had a heart attack. Maybe he passed out before the crash. Maybe, Miller said, but we found something else. What? Jessica asked, her voice rising slightly. We found brake fluid on the garage floor at Mr. Mitchell's house, Miller said slowly, and we found fresh tool marks on the brake lines of the wreckage. The room went deadly silent. Marcus stood up so fast his chair fell over backward. Tool marks, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, Miller said, his eyes locking onto Marcus. It looks like someone cut the lines. This wasn't an accident, Mr. Mitchell. This was attempted murder. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Who would do such a thing? Robert was loved by everyone. We're checking security cameras now, Miller said. Mr. Mitchell had a very sophisticated surveillance system installed in his garage. We should have the footage within the hour. Robert felt Jessica's hand on the bed rail. She was gripping it so hard the metal creaked. She knew. She realized instantly that the garage had cameras. She realized Marcus had been filmed. Marcus looked at Jessica, panic flooding his eyes. Tiff, he whispered. Shut up, she hissed. And then Robert opened his eyes. It was time. He sat up slowly in the hospital bed. He pulled the bandage off his head. The fake blood smeared across his forehead. He looked directly at his son. You don't need to wait an hour, Chief, Robert said, his voice clear and strong. I have the footage right here. Marcus screamed. He actually screamed, stumbling backward and hitting the wall. Jessica froze, her face going pale. Dad? Marcus whimpered. Hello, son, Robert said. I see you're upset about the car. It's a shame. I really love that car. But not as much as I loved you. He reached under the pillow and pulled out a tablet. He tapped the screen. The video of Marcus cutting the brake lines started playing. He turned the screen so they could see it. I watched you do it, Marcus, Robert said quietly. I watched you crawl under my car. I watched you cut the lines. I watched you cry. And then I watched you walk away and leave me to die. No, Marcus sobbed, sliding down the wall to the floor. No, 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 no. And you, Jessica, Robert said, turning to her. I have video of you threatening your father in his hospital bed, confessing to the poisoning. All of it. Jessica looked at the door. She looked at the window. She was calculating escape routes. Don't bother, Robert said. The hallway is full of officers. Chief Miller stepped forward and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click echoed in the small room. Marcus Mitchell, Jessica Evans, Miller said, his voice filling the space. You are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and elder abuse. Robert watched as Miller cuffed Marcus first. His son didn't fight. He just wept, his whole body shaking. Miller then turned to Jessica. She thrashed, kicking, spitting, screaming obscenities. You old bastard, she shrieked as the officers dragged her toward the door. You should have died. Why won't you just die? Her voice echoed down the corridor, fading into the distance as the heavy doors swung shut. And then there was only Marcus. He stood in the center of the room, handcuffed, trembling. He looked at the tablet where his crime was frozen in time. He looked at the door where his wife had just been dragged out screaming. And then he looked at Robert, and for just a moment, Robert saw the little boy again. The boy who used to wait on the porch. The boy who used to say, I love you, Dad, before bed every night. That boy was still in there somewhere, buried under the debt and the fear and the greed. But it was too late. Marcus dropped to his knees on the cold hospital floor. He bowed his head until it nearly touched the tile. Dad, he sobbed, the sound raw and broken. I'm sorry. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do it, I swear. I was just so scared. I was so scared. Robert looked down at him, his son, his only child, the boy he had raised, the man who had tried to kill him. A single tear rolled down Robert's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I can forgive a lot of things, Marcus," Robert said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can forgive you for losing money. I can forgive you for being weak. I can forgive you for not visiting me. I can even forgive you for being ungrateful." Marcus looked up, his face wet with tears, his eyes begging for mercy. "But I cannot forgive this," Robert said, leaning forward so their faces were inches apart. "I can forgive the stupidity of a child, Marcus, but I will never forgive a man who tries to kill the father who raised him just to feed the greed of a woman who hates him." Marcus flinched as if Robert had slapped him. "You chose her," Robert said. "You chose the money. You chose the easy way out. You chose to cut my brakes instead of asking me for help, and now you have to live with that choice." Robert nodded to the officer standing by the door. "Take him away. Please, Dad," Marcus wailed as the officer grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. "Don't let them take me. Please. I'm your son." Robert turned his back on him. He looked out the window at the city skyline, the buildings he had spent his life inspecting, the streets he had walked for 70 years. "I have no son," Robert whispered. "My son died the moment he crawled under that car." The officer led Marcus out. The door closed. The room was silent again. Chief Miller walked over and handed Robert a handkerchief. "You okay, Robert?" he asked. Robert took a deep breath. The air smelled of disinfectant and freedom. "I'm alive, Miller," Robert said. "I'm alive." The Cook County Courthouse smelled of old wood, coffee, and nervous sweat. Robert sat in the second row of the gallery, hands folded in his lap, wearing a navy suit. Next to him sat Thomas Evans in a wheelchair, a blanket over his knees. The stroke had left the left side of his face sagging slightly, and his left hand curled inward like a claw. But his eyes were sharp. Two fathers, two victims, two survivors watching their children face justice. The courtroom was half full. Reporters sat in the back, pens poised. A few curious locals, family members who hadn't taken sides. The judge was a stern woman in her late 50s, glasses perched on the end of her nose. She had seen every kind of lie in her 20 years on the bench. She had seen greed dressed up as grief. She had seen families tear themselves apart over money, but even she paused when the evidence began to play. Jessica stood first. Even in the orange jumpsuit of the county jail, she tried to maintain an air of superiority. She had fired her public defender 3 times. She had tried to represent herself, turning the trial into a circus of accusations and denials. She claimed Robert was abusive. She claimed Thomas was senile. She claimed the videos were deepfakes. She threw every lie she could find at the wall, hoping something would stick. Nothing stuck. The evidence was concrete. The video of Marcus cutting the brake lines. Time-stamped. High definition. Undeniable. The audio recording of Jessica confessing over Thomas's hospital bed. "The bottle was for Robert. You drank it. Stay quiet or I ruin your reputation." The lab report confirming digoxin and ethylene glycol in the bottle residue. The financial record showing £500,000 in debt, Russian loan sharks, and a £4 million motive. The prosecutor played the hospital confession video. The courtroom fell silent as Jessica's voice filled the room. "If you tell anyone, Daddy, I'll destroy your reputation. I'll say you tried to kill yourself." When it ended, even the reporters had stopped typing. The judge looked at Jessica over the rim of her glasses. "Jessica Evans," she said, her voice flat and cold, "you have shown absolutely no remorse. You manipulated your husband. You poisoned your own father. You plotted the death of your father-in-law. You treated human life like a transaction." Jessica stood. "It wasn't me," she shrieked. She pointed at Marcus, who was sitting at the defense table, head down. "It was him. He did it all. He's the one with the gambling debt. He begged me to help. I told him no. I told him we shouldn't do it, but he forced me." Marcus looked up slowly. He had lost weight in jail. His suit hung off his shoulders. He looked small, broken. He didn't speak. He just stared at Jessica, the woman he had destroyed his life for. The judge banged her gavel. For the attempted murder of Thomas Evans and the conspiracy to commit murder against Robert Mitchell, I sentence you to 20 years in a federal correctional facility. No possibility of parole for the first 15 years. Jessica's knees buckled. She looked back at the gallery, searching for someone to save her. "Daddy," she wailed, looking at Thomas. "Daddy, please. Tell them I'm a good girl. Tell them." Thomas didn't speak. He couldn't speak quickly anymore. The stroke had stolen that from him. But he did something louder than any words. He reached out with his good hand and unlocked the brake on his wheelchair. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his back to her. He rolled himself toward the exit, refusing to look at the daughter who had traded his life for money. It was the coldest, most necessary thing Robert had ever seen. Jessica was dragged out, heels scraping on the floor, her screams turning into animalistic howls that faded as the steel door clanged shut. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood slowly. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the gallery. He stared at his shoes. He had pleaded guilty. He had confessed to everything in a quiet, monotone voice during the deposition. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge said, her tone softening just a fraction, "you are under extreme duress. You cooperated with the prosecution. However, you held the wire cutters. You made the choice to act. Weakness is not a defense for attempted murder." "I know," Marcus whispered. "I know." "I sentence you to 15 years, the judge said. 15 years. He would be 50 years old when he got out. His youth, his future, all gone because he couldn't say no to a woman who wanted a lifestyle he couldn't afford." Marcus turned around. He looked for Robert. Their eyes locked. Robert saw the little boy who used to wait for him on the porch. The teenager he taught to shave. The man who had tried to kill him. Robert stood up. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just nodded. It was a nod of acknowledgement. A nod that said, "I'm still here. I'm watching, but I cannot save you from this." Marcus nodded back, tears streaming down his face. Then the bailiff took his arm, and Robert's son walked through the door into the darkness of the prison system. Robert walked out of the courthouse, pushing Thomas's wheelchair. The sun was shining outside, bright and almost offensive. It felt wrong that the world was still turning when their family had just ceased to exist. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The war was over. They had won. But the victory tasted like ash. A week later, the financial fallout hit. With both Marcus and Jessica in prison, the mortgage on their house went into default immediately. The bank posted the foreclosure notice on the front door. The Russian loan sharks, realizing their targets were now property of the state and beyond their reach, vanished into the shadows. The house went up for auction on a rainy Tuesday morning. Robert went to the auction. It was a modern McMansion in the suburbs, all glass and fake stone, with columns that served no purpose and a 3-car garage. It was the symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Marcus and Jessica. A house built on debt, filled with things they didn't need, bought with money they didn't have. Robert stood in the back of the crowd of investors and property flippers. He listened to the auctioneer rattle off numbers. 300,000, 300,000, 400. Robert raised his paddle. 500,000, he said. Cash. The room went silent. The other bidders looked at him. They saw an old man in a work coat. They didn't know he was the father of the man who had lost it all. They didn't know he was buying the tomb of his son's life. "Sold!" the auctioneer yelled. Robert walked up and wrote the check. It was a lot of money. But he had a plan. He wasn't going to flip it. He wasn't going to live in it. He couldn't live in a house where the walls whispered about murder. He hired a crew the next day. They gutted it. They tore out the marble countertops Jessica had bragged about. They tore out the wine cellar. They tore out the home theater and the walk-in closets filled with designer clothes she'd never worn. They tore out the lies. In their place, they put sturdy bunk beds, a commercial kitchen capable of feeding 50 people, a counseling office, a playground in the back garden. They turned the master bedroom, the room where Marcus and Jessica had plotted Robert's death, into a bright, cheerful playroom for children. Toys, books, laughter. Robert called it Hope House. It took 3 months to finish the renovation. When they opened the doors, it was a shelter for homeless families, specifically for fathers who had fallen on hard times and were trying to keep their children together. Men who had made mistakes, men who had lost their way, but men who were willing to work to rebuild their lives. Robert remembered the day they opened. It was a crisp autumn morning. The first family walked through the door, a young man named David, holding the hand of his 5-year-old daughter. David looked tired. He looked beaten down by the world. He looked a little bit like Marcus did before the greed consumed him. "Welcome," Robert said, shaking David's hand at the door. "Is this real?" David asked, looking around at the clean, warm space. "It used to be a house of lies," Robert said. "Now it's a house of truth. You're safe here, son," David cried. He hugged his daughter tight, and Robert saw the look in his eyes. Gratitude, dignity, hope. That night, Robert sat in the office of Hope House, looking at the plaque on the wall. It read, "Dedicated to the rebuilding of broken foundations." Robert had spent his life inspecting buildings, looking for faults. He couldn't fix the fault line in his own son. He couldn't retrofit Marcus's character, but he could build something new on the ruins of that failure. He drove home that night to his own empty house. It was quiet, but it wasn't lonely anymore. He had Thomas. He had the men at Hope House, and he had the peace of knowing that while his bloodline had failed him, his legacy would not. He sat in his armchair, the one where he had opened the whiskey bottle all those weeks ago. He poured himself a glass of iced tea. "To justice," Robert whispered to the empty room, "and to the hard work of starting over." The phone rang. It was Thomas. "Robert," Thomas said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Are you watching the game?" "I'm turning it on now, Thomas," Robert said, picking up the remote. Life went on. It had to, even when it breaks your heart. One Saturday morning, a few weeks later, Robert and Thomas drove out to Lake Windermere. Robert had rented a small boat. They packed sandwiches, a thermos of tea, and 2 fishing rods. The lake was calm, the water like glass reflecting the gray sky above. Robert helped Thomas into the boat. Thomas couldn't walk well, but he could sit. He could hold a rod. He could be a man again, not just a patient. They rowed out to the middle of the lake and dropped anchor. Robert baited the hooks. They cast their lines and sat in silence, watching the bobbers float on the gentle ripples. "Do you ever think about them?" Thomas asked after a long while. His words were slow, slurred slightly, but clear enough. "Every day," Robert said. "But not the man who cut the brakes or the woman who threatened you. I think about the boy Marcus used to be. The little girl Jessica was before the world twisted her. I hope, wherever they are, they find their way back. But I can't wait for them anymore." Thomas nodded. "You did right, Robert." "I did what I had to do," Robert said. They fished in silence. The sun moved slowly across the sky. A fish tugged on Thomas's line. Robert helped him reel it in. It was a small perch, nothing special, but Thomas laughed. It was a slow, crooked laugh, but it was real. It was the first time Robert had heard him laugh since the poisoning. Robert laughed too, 2 old men acting like boys. That evening, Robert sat alone in his study. He opened the drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was a picture from 20 years ago. Robert, Sarah, and Marcus at the seaside. Marcus was about 10 years old, grinning at the camera, holding up a bucket full of shells. Sarah had her arm around Robert's waist. They all looked so happy. Robert touched the frame gently. "I kept my promise, Sarah," he whispered. "I protected him as long as I could, but in the end, I had to protect others from him." He placed the photo back in the drawer and closed it. He turned on the television. A football match was on. He watched without really seeing it. He thought about David and his daughter at Hope House. He thought about the fathers learning to rebuild. He thought about the foundations he was still laying, even at 70 years old. Legacy isn't blood, Robert thought. It's the foundations you leave behind after the rot is removed. He leaned back in his chair. He sipped his tea. He smiled. Just a small one. He was alive. He was free. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt like home again. Hello, everyone. This is Shafi again. Thank you so much for listening to Robert's story. If this touched you, if it reminded you of your own pain or your own strength, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And listen, if you have a story you want to share, a story of betrayal, of survival, of fighting back against the people who were supposed to love you, send it to me at mabelbusiness@gmail.com. I'll share it here, and your name will stay completely anonymous. We're building a community here, a community of people who refuse to be victims, who refuse to let greed and cruelty win. Thank you for being part of that. Until next time, take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and remember, family isn't always blood. Family is the people who show up when it matters.